Hello, Mr. Brown here, your science teacher. Do you like science? I know I do. Join me today as we look at the science of ecological succession. So, what is this? Well, basically, it's a very predictable pattern in nature. It follows the same sequence of events every single time. You always begin with bare rock. Then the first guys to come in and colonize are lichens, mosses, grasses, and weeds. Give it enough time, you'll begin to see small seedlings. A forest will develop and eventually big hardwoods. It happens like this time and time again every time. It's succession and it's scientific fact. Every time that there's bare rock, the first ones to show up are called pioneer species. And it's the same cast of characters every single time. Mosses, lichen, weeds, flowers, grasses. Give it enough time and eventually you'll have a small forest. Give that enough time and it will mature into what we call a climax community, the biggest trees of the forest. Well, what happens if there is a forest fire? Well, this fire you see right here is not that bad. Most of the trees will survive, not a big deal, but some of these can get really destructive and burn down the whole forest. What happens then? We know what's going to happen. Ecological succession will happen the same way that it does every single time. The first pioneers to come back and repopulate the forest will be lichens, mosses, grasses, flowers, and the cycle will continue over and over again. What happens if a farmer abandons her field and doesn't plow or plant anymore? Ecological succession will occur in the same sequence that it always does. Grasses and flowers will come in, followed by smaller trees and shrubs, and then eventually the climax community of big hardwoods. What happens if you were to abandon your house and never return? Ecological succession in the same sequence of events, right? First, weeds and vines and grasses will engulf your house. Then small trees and shrubs will grow. And then, after a while, a forest. What happens if the road in front of your house is never used again? Ecological succession comes in the same manner that it always does. You can see this road here, grasses and shrubs beginning to grow. Give this road, maybe 100 years, and you won't even know there's a road anymore. It will be swallowed up by a forest. Here's an old railroad tracks. We don't use them anymore. Succession is back at it. I can see some shrubs and trees beginning to grow. So there was this documentary that came out in 2009 on the History Channel called Life After People. And what they did is they used computer animation and science to look into a possible future. What would happen if all the people were gone? What would happen to our cities? For example, Washington, D.C. would eventually revert back to a swamp. You can see the Washington Monument here, all covered with moss and algae. Here we can see Paris, France, and it would return to the woodland that it was before it was a city. Looks like part of the Eiffel Tower has rusted away. Here we see New York City as the skyscrapers get engulfed in trees and shrubs. Even Las Vegas, Nevada will eventually be covered up by the sands of the desert. A really cool show. You should check it out sometime. Anyway, another great example of succession is Mount St. Helens. Everything was going good on this day back in 1980 until It blew up in a giant supervolcano. May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens blows its top off and essentially destroys everything in a 100-mile radius. It pumped out huge amounts of smoke and ash and dust and covered a big majority of the United States of America. A young Mr. Brown is at this event in Wisconsin, and I am 7 years old at this time. And I said to my parents, "Why are my toys covered in this powder?" "Oh, that's not powder, that's volcanic ash. And that's not a snowplow." Well, it is a snowplow, but it's plowing volcanic ash dumped by the supervolcano. You don't want to really breathe this stuff in. This is what it looks like under a microscope. It looks really sharp and serrated. Anyway, it destroyed the area around the mountain. And what happens next? You know what happens next. Ecological succession. Mosses, lichen, grasses, and flowers began to recolonize just the way it happens every time there's a disaster. You can see this cool photo of before and after, and a small forest community is beginning to grow. Here we can see the crater up at the top of Mount St. Helens with a lake of captured rainwater forming. Which leads me to another question. What happens to lakes? Well, every lake will suffer the same fate. All lakes are destined to be filled in by trees and plant matter and sediment and mud, and eventually dry up, get filled in, and disappear. That's the fate of all lakes, right? And we can actually see that happen. Let's take a look at the Wisconsin River flowing right through the middle of Wisconsin. Many thousands of years ago, it flowed through a state park called Rocky Arbor State Park. You can visit it today. And that is the old river bottom. Today, it's a forest, right? And it's just outside Wisconsin Dells. You can visit it. This used to be an island in the ancient Wisconsin River. So go and visit it. Pretty cool. Anyway, a couple other examples. We have the Aral Sea in southern Russia. Back in the 1950s, it was a big lake, but it suffers the fate of all lakes. It is drying up and is disappearing pretty fast. Probably within your lifetime, it'll be gone. Which leads to some weird sights of all these old ships that are sitting miles from the nearest water. That used to be the Aral Sea years ago. And there they sit, dry land. Take a look at Lake Chad in Africa. Back in the 1960s, it was a big lake, but it's been drying up. And slowly, it's disappearing. Within your lifetime, it'll be gone. Here's a satellite view of Lake Chad. Let's take a look here in the States. In the state of Utah, we have the Great Salt Lake. And on the shores of Salt Lake City, Utah, Great Salt Lake is drying up and dying. It used to be a grand Lake Bonneville 18,000 years ago, but it's been drying up and leaving its salt content behind, making it even saltier than the ocean. Within your lifetime, the Great Salt Lake will probably be gone, and this is all that'll be left is a crunchy, salty desert. What about the Great Lakes? What will happen to them? You already know what's going to happen to them. Eventually, they'll be gone, but it's going to take a while. For right now, they have this whole area is the rainfall watershed that replenishes the lakes every time it rains in this area. And they're deep. All right, so as sediment fills in these lakes, it's going to take a while because they are hundreds of feet deep. So I'm assuming the Great Lakes will be around for millions of years to come, but eventually they will get filled in and dry up. Let's go out to southern Russia to Lake Baikal. All right, looks like a nice lake. What's so special about Lake Baikal? Well, it's the oldest, deepest, clearest, most voluminous lake in the world. It's 25 million years old. Well, why didn't succession work here? I mean, doesn't it work on this lake? Well, yeah, it does. It's trying. Nature has put about 1,000 feet of sediment at the bottom, but you can see in this graphic just how deep it is. It's going to be a while before Lake Baikal gets filled up. Not to mention, it's on a fault line and the earth keeps splitting further. Here's beautiful Lake Tahoe. Why do we care about Lake Tahoe on the border of California? Well, these people care because it's kind of fun to maybe have a little party, but it is really, really deep. So it's going to be quite a while before Lake Tahoe gets filled in with sediment and dries up. I'm going to give that like a couple million years. Some lakes, as they dry up, like this one, form little mini lakelets. Look at those cute little mini lakes. As this lake is drying up, you can walk around and see all the little lakelets. So that's interesting. Do we know of a lake that has disappeared? Yeah, right in the middle of Wisconsin. The Ice Age glacial Lake Wisconsin used to exist right in the middle of the state 12,000 years ago. There's a place called Roshikri State Park that you can visit, and it's got this big rock. That used to be an island in the middle of this ancient lake. Even today, the area of this part of Wisconsin is still sandy, like a lake bottom. But that lake is gone. What we assume happened, it was being dammed up by ice and glaciers. Eventually, one day, those glaciers melted and broke open, releasing the entire lake. Some geologists think that this happened all within a few hours. The entire lake drained out. This is evidenced in the Wisconsin Dells. Thanks for joining me today on The Science of Succession. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.